Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for today's Evergreen conversation. I'm Colleen Repko, class of 2002 and Director of Alumni Engagement here at Loyola. And as a former political science major, I am very excited to be joined today by Doug Harris, Professor of Political Science at Loyola, and looking forward to hearing his perspective on the 2020 election and the state of the parties. And so before I turn this over, just a few housekeeping items. First, this event is being recorded and it will be posted to the alumni website in the coming days. And second, if you have any questions during the presentation, please post them to the chat and we'll do our very best to get to them at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Professor Harris.
Great. I'm just hoping everybody can see my screen here, which is the Loyola Bridge on Charles Street. Welcome to what, if you can see behind me, appears to be the quad at Loyola. I'm Doug Harris, and I'm going to be talking about the current presidential election and the state of the race. I think we can all agree that this has been the most unstable, uncertain time in memory. I mean, if you just take stock of what's happened thus far in 2020, even into the last days of 2019, it seems at that point that we might be on the brink of war with Iran. The president had been impeached and was awaiting a Senate trial. The speaker quite famously and publicly ripped up the president's State of the Union address. And of course, the pandemic hit and much of the economy and schools closed all over the country. We all became concerned with public health matters, economic decisions, and the path forward. Add to that Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and the protest and unrest that ensued. In terms of just electoral politics, Joe Biden went from lackluster performances in Iowa and New Hampshire to catapulting to first in South Carolina. By early March, his opponents were dropping out and endorsing him in short order. He secured the nomination, solidified Democratic support, and selected the first African-American woman vice president nominee in American history. This has all happened in 1 year, and it's only October. But what's notable is that all of these major disruptions in American society, economy, political processes, and these historical events have not seemed to move the basic contours of this election. This has been a remarkably and historically stable race. Real Clear Politics is a site that gives an average of recent polls at any given point in time. It produces horse race figures like this one. Only most of them don't look like this one, right? So this is Biden and Trump currently. More so than other recent presidential elections, this gap that Biden has enjoyed since January and before is atypical. So I went back and I looked at a couple of recent presidential elections. This is Bush versus Kerry. And you can see that it was neck and neck for a lot of 2004. And then there's widening in September. Kerry does recover toward the end to make it a close race. But for the most part, this was a volatile race. And for a lot of the year, it was close. If you look at McCain, Obama, the same is true. And really, it's McCain surges ahead in September. Republicans tend to have good Septembers, and then there is some the economic collapse, and then there's a growing momentum for Obama. But again, this race at points McCain was leading, at points Obama was leading. If you look at Romney, Obama starts with a relatively big lead. But Romney comes in and he tightens that lead, overtakes Obama, especially after a lackluster debate performance by Obama in the first presidential debate. But there was volatility in this race, and the lead did change hands once or twice. And this is the Trump-Clinton race, and of course, it was a wide margin at the beginning, but there were points at which Trump overtook Clinton, and certainly by the end, in October, Trump narrows the gap in that race. So it's in that context that I look at this, right? This is, again, Trump-Biden from this year. The consistent story of 2020 has been Biden leads Trump. Before he had the nomination, even before COVID hit, Biden was in the lead. Biden led Trump in head-to-heads by 5 points or more as of January 1st. You can see it's a 5.7 lead here. That widened in the summer, settled back to about 5 points after the conventions, and has slowly edged up since. So if you, just to review this, he led by 5, almost 6 as of January 1st, before he even had the nomination. The lead grew to 10 and slightly above 10 in late June, when COVID was at its worst for a lot of people. It hovered between 7 and 8 until Trump brought it back to 5.7 in September. And then the first debate on September 29th, the president's diagnosed with COVID, and that becomes public on, I think it was October 2nd. And the gap starts to widen again. It's tightening now to about 7, but this is a consistent lead. Trying to change the direction of the race, the Trump campaign has tried to focus attention on Biden himself, his age, his capabilities, his policies. Either he's too beholden to the left of his party, a socialist, or he's too cautious, right? The president said during the first debate a couple of times, you just lost the left, you just lost the left. He's also trying to focus on Biden's son Hunter, or on Joe Biden's past acts in government. But despite all of these attempts, this hasn't really become what we would call a choice election. It's always been a referendum on Trump. And this is something that political scientists might expect, right? V.O. Key Jr., who was arguably the most important American political scientist of the 20th century, argued that most electoral choices are retrospective evaluations of the party in power. This is especially the case when an incumbent president is running for re-election. In this formulation that Key posited back in the 1950s and 1960s, the electorate is the rational god of vengeance and reward. Trump started with a historically small coalition in 2016. And I think the story here is that he was never able to grow that support. So my point is, it's not only been a stable election, it's been a very eventful but politically stable 4 years. In nearly 4 years, there's been almost no high quality polling, and I'm being cautious here when I say almost, that had Trump's approval higher than his disapproval. He's been underwater, as we say, throughout his term. He's not broken through to have a majority coalition behind him. And it seems that he still doesn't. So Trump never grew his coalition from 2016. And we can argue as to whether or not this was the fact that his opponents never gave him a chance, or if he followed the base logic, what political scientists call the benefit seekers logic, of maintaining a unified, dedicated, if ultimately small coalition. Whether this was foisted upon Trump or this was a strategic choice to Trump to play to the base is debatable. It does seem, though, that Trump's unapologetic approach has both galvanized and limited his support. This is what we sometimes call a small tent strategy. If you look at this slide here gives Trump's approval compared to the approval in the first term of Presidents Reagan, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. And of all of those other presidents, you can see a great deal of volatility. Sometimes they have high points, sometimes they have low points. And you also see that most of them, with a handful of exceptions, have higher rates of approval than Trump has ever enjoyed. So what I see here when I look at this comparative data, I see that his approval has always been lower than most presidents, and it's basically been a flat line. In an era of distrust in government and distrust in politicians and of polarization, it would have been difficult for him to break out of this pattern, right? Combativeness was his style all along, and opposition to him was immediate, strong, and persistent. But in terms of approval by category, you'll see comparing Republicans to what we call Republican leaners, to independents, to Democratic leaners, to Democrats. There is a big difference in each of those categories. Republicans tend to still approve of Trump. But the real story here is not just the difference among these categories and how Trump is perceived, but the story is also he lost in every category from beginning to end, but only a little among Republicans. The big story here is the double-digit loss with Republican leaners from 77 to 62, and especially among independents from 42 to 31. I think it's a political scientist would also point out that Republicans are losing out in terms of their proportion of the electorate politically, with people perhaps leaving the party, and there's been a lot of variation there. And demographically, just the Republican coalition seems to skew older than the Democratic coalition, and has for the last several election cycles. This is then the election that many of us thought it would be, right? Especially after the blue wave election of 2018. But that's far from saying it's over. As Loyola alum Mike Memoli, who covers the Biden campaign for NBC and is known as NBC's Biden Whisperer, Mike tweeted just the other day, at Real Donald Trump, insisting to his team that he can still win. Biden's campaign insisting to supporters that they can still lose. So Biden is cautioning his troops that they could still lose. Trump is trying to gin up support among his troops that, as in 2016, it's not over until the votes are counted. Trump still has some advantages, and I wanted to talk a bit about what those are. So the Electoral College in this era gives Republicans an advantage, right? There are other eras in which it has advantaged Democrats, but as with 2016, Trump has a head start because of the way the Electoral College is apportioned. And where it's probably almost assured that he won't win the popular vote, there are likely possibilities still of his winning an Electoral College victory, even though he doesn't get the most popular votes. A second plus on Trump's column is that voting has become more difficult in the age of COVID. And as a behavioral matter, the voting mechanisms and processes that Democrats prefer are more likely to lead to spoiled ballots, more likely to lead to the ballot not being counted for one reason or another due to technical things that happen within states. I should also add that the way that Democrats vote tend in many states to be counted later. So that might have an effect on how the results roll in on election night and in the day or days thereafter. I think it's also the case that Republicans have shown in the last year some advantages in key states when it comes to new voter registration. And that's something that Democrats should keep an eye on. I think Democrats would counter that they had gotten the low-lying fruit of new registrants for the 2018 cycle, but still Republicans have been gaining ground since 2018 in terms of new voter registration. I'll also add that Trump has an advantage is that he's the president of the United States, and there are advantages of incumbency. Those are more pronounced at lower level offices, Senate and especially House. But it is tough to unseat a sitting incumbent president, and the Trump campaign has been comparatively unrestrained in its willingness to use the office and the perks of the office and the backdrop of the office for its campaign events, including the Republican National Convention. A final thing going for Trump is that there's still time. There's not much of it. I've been focused for the last month on how at this point in the race, President Trump needs events. He needs something to change the trajectory, right? His diagnosis with COVID was actually one of them. It was an opportunity in a political sense that made me think of the Reagan White House post-assassination. After the assassination attempt, the political operation in the Reagan White House was polling and figuring out how this was going to extend his honeymoon. I thought of the diagnosis as this opportunity for the president to maybe change direction, but that seems to not have happened. Some would say that that's a result that there was messaging problems and confusion and recklessness that might have squandered that opportunity. I tend to think that it was the more voters are thinking about COVID as opposed to the economy, the more voters are thinking about the pandemic generally, the more that works in Biden's favor in this retrospective choice. The debate was another opportunity. The debate tonight is still a key opportunity. But that first debate seemed to actually work against Trump and reinforce some of the concerns that people have had. And his polling was not moving in the direction that it seemed to need to move. He's running out of time, and it's hard to see how he changes the dynamic of the race. I think a Biden misstep is his best hope. But that has failed to materialize at this point. In some ways, Biden has been more disciplined as a candidate this time around than we really expect from Joe Biden and have expected and have seen in the past. But of course, then there's this lingering specter of 2016. A lot of political scientists, a lot of pollsters were saying that Trump couldn't win. Can he win despite what all of the data and all of this political science knowledge suggests? Biden also has opportunities, right? This is a strong field for him, and in a retrospective choice, his main calling card is that he is not the president. Most of the public right now thinks that the country is on the wrong track, and it's always the case that the incumbent pays a price for that, sometimes the price of reelection. Herbert Hoover and Jimmy Carter are good examples of how environmental factors that might be beyond the control of the sitting president can affect the incumbent's reelect chances. It's also the case that the national public, attitudinally and demographically, is and has been trending left. Trump has accelerated this, but not caused it. Biden is preferred over Trump on most issues, especially the handling of COVID and healthcare, which was healthcare being such a big issue in 2018. And now in the most recent polling, it seems Biden has fought to parity. And in one recent poll seems to be ahead of Trump on handling of the economy. So the factors that may have been working for in Trump's favor 3 weeks ago seem to be also moving in the other direction. Biden, compared to Clinton, has closed large gaps among men and older voters. gaps that Trump had widened in the 2016 election, and Biden is even ahead with older demographics now. If you look at this poll from this week, New York Times Siena College, this has Biden winning in every age category, some more than others, of course. But that 10-point gap among 65 and older is pretty significant, given that Trump won those voters in 2016. Importantly, Biden trails by less with white voters than Clinton had, and he's winning large proportions of non-white voters. Worth noting here at the bottom is Biden is beating Trump among independents by almost 10 points. That's the one of the determining figures here. If these national figures are important to give us the shape of the race, the presidency, as I remind my students all the time, is not won in a national contest, but in a series of statewide contests in pursuit of 270 electoral votes. My students, this semester, I'm teaching a course on American political parties and elections. So my students and I have been examining and making predictions on the election, studying voter behavior, making arguments as to who will win the key Senate races and the White House. So for reference, as we go to the maps, here's the 2016 Electoral College map. Not atypical of the era. Democrats won in the Northeast and on the West Coast. But Trump was able to pull off, as you'll recall, unexpected wins in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, though by narrow margins. But also putting Ohio and Florida back into the Republican column. Trump's victories in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania helped put him over the top. Recently, we had Kyle Kondik, who's the executive editor of the Crystal Ball at UVA's Center for Politics, to campus, well, virtually to campus, to talk to my class and to give the university's Constitution Day lecture. Here we have the most recent Crystal Ball Electoral College predictions, right? So this is from this week, updated as it says on October 8th, so not quite this week. Couple of things that are of note. So first, the GOP still has its head start. It still has structural advantages in the Electoral College. Smaller population states win out, and Republicans are stronger there in those smaller states overall. Larger states, more populous states, actually lose out in the Electoral College because the apportionment works so that that population has to divide electors more than smaller population states do. That is per capita. But Biden has competitive advantages here. At present, in this map, that have helped him to overcome that Republican head start in the Electoral College. So here's what's key. Biden's reclaiming Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania with somewhere between 7 and 10 point leads in the first two, and a 4 to 7 point lead in Pennsylvania. And he seems likely this go around to add Arizona to the Democratic side. And if you look at this map, all of these toss-up states, Iowa, Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, all of these toss-up states were Trump states in 2016. And the fact that Texas, where I lived for 3 years before coming to Loyola, Texas is wobbly and it's unlikely to switch. But Republicans typically don't have to worry about Texas. So the fact that they're worried in October is a sign that the national trend of the electorate is putting more states in play, but putting more states in play in Biden's favor rather than President Trump's favor. Overall, the map is moving away from Trump when he really needed to be putting back together that razor-thin coalition that had led him to win in 2016. And then there are campaign effects, right? So Biden's fundraising is strong. Trump has less cash on hand at this point in the race. There have been reports that he's pulling down ads in key states to try to concentrate money in other states, and probably try to recreate the magic that he had in 2016 of garnering what's called free media or earned media if you're a campaign professional. Biden's avoided the gaffes for which he's famous for the most part. The Trump campaign seems to be in disarray in a lot of ways, and it's struggling to find a message and a path forward. And I think one of the things that we see is, because this is the fundamental dynamic of the race, the Trump campaign is making riskier choices. Well, what happens with riskier choices? Well, when they pay off, something good could happen, something dramatic could happen. But what's the downside of risky choices? They usually don't pay off. So though it's not impossible, again, remember 2016, it's difficult to imagine a Trump victory at this point. Political scientists would have to go back to the drawing board for 4 more years if there's another surprise. Indeed, it's much easier to imagine a Biden landslide that would push the Senate majority, which I think now is likely, up to the mid 50s. A Senate majority is likely, but it's possible that that could push that up to 53, 54, 55 seats for the Democrats, if there is this really big push among the last remaining undecided voters in the Democrats' favor. This is from the Cook Political Report, and so basically this divides the Electoral College states into solid Democrat, likely Democrat, lean Democrat, toss-up, lean Republican, likely Republican, solid Republican. Trump would have to win not only all of his solid, likely, and lean states, but also all of the toss-ups. And then he'd have to run the table on the toss-ups and then pick up at least 2 that the Cook Political Report lists as lean Democrat to make the math work. It's not just any 2. He couldn't pick the smallest 2. Impossible? No. If there's a significant demographic shift, and if the late breaking undecided voters break in Trump's favor, as they did in 2016, you could push those toss-ups in that direction. And it's not like having to run the table on individual states, but there's an overall dynamic that means that if one state falls, other states are likely to fall as well. And if Trump is winning all of those toss-ups, he's probably hit on something demographically or in an issue or ideological sense in the last 2 weeks that could put Pennsylvania and perhaps Arizona out of that lean Democratic category and give Trump enough to win. Again, is this likely? No. The time's running out. The issues seem to be breaking in the wrong direction. The campaign mechanics seem to favor the Democrats. President Trump would have to get some breaks, run the table, and quite frankly, get lucky. This is important too for the prospects of Senate control and just how big the Democratic majority will be in the House of Representatives. Democrats need to pick up 3 or 4 seats to win the majority control of the Senate. If they hold everything, that is, they have to pick up 3 if Biden and Harris win. They have to pick up 4 if they don't to win majority control. And the truth of the matter is that they are likely to lose Doug Jones' Democratic seat in Alabama, which means they need 4 or 5. But the Senate 2020 map favors Democrats in a big way. So if I talked before about the Electoral College working in Republicans' favor, this year's Senate map works for Democrats. And the reason it works for Democrats is that the seats that are up in 2020 were the seats that were won in 2014. And 2014 was a big Republican year. So the GOP is protecting more territory than Democrats. And the Democrats look likely right now to pick up seats in Colorado, Arizona. They're more competitive than I think people would have guessed 9 months ago in Iowa. And they are quite competitive in Maine and North Carolina. In fact, they're more competitive than anyone might have expected in Montana, in part because they have a very good Democratic candidate and the former governor there. But people who pay attention to elections are also paying attention to Georgia's 2 Senate races, Kansas, South Carolina. Another good and very well-funded Democratic candidate is making that more of a race, and an independent candidacy in Alaska, that independent who said that he would caucus with the Democrats. All of those seem to be possibilities. They might be distant possibilities, but basically what we're seeing in the Senate race, like we're seeing in the Electoral College, is that the Democrats are expanding the map, expanding the places where they're competitive, and making it harder for Republicans. And it also makes it costlier for Republicans because they have to spend money to defend those seats, and that's money they could be spending elsewhere. Absent some unforeseen shift at the last minute, this seems like too much to defend. I suspect that we'll see a Democratic Senate next Congress, with the real question being how big a majority will they have. So this is from the Cook Political Report. Again, these are the 12 seats that Democrats have to defend. And as you'll see, 10 of them are solid Democrat. The one that the Democrats are likely to lose, of course, is this Jones seat in Alabama. Republicans have a very good and well-funded candidate in Michigan that has made that Michigan seat a little more competitive in an otherwise good Democratic year and an otherwise Democratic state against the incumbent. So if we do see a Republican trend right at the end, it's Peters in Michigan who might lose, as well as Jones in Alabama. These are the 23 seats. Remember, 2014 was a very good year for Republicans in the Senate. These are the 23 seats that Republicans have to defend, and you'll see that 2 are already thought of as in analogous terms. Jones' seat is thought of on the Democratic page. McSally and Gardner in Arizona and Colorado. The demographics just seem to have shifted, and each of them has run up against a very good Democratic challenger candidate that has made it quite likely that Democrats will pick up those seats. And then we have these toss-ups here, 7 of them. I'm not quite sure I would put South Carolina as a toss-up, maybe closer to the lean R category. But this gives you an idea of the 23 seats that Republicans have to defend in the Senate, how many of them the Democrats have quite a good shot at winning. Democratic prospects in the House. These are not all the House races, of course, but Democratic prospects in the House are pretty good too. But I'll add the Democratic gains probably won't be as dramatic if we do have that big Biden win and the Democrats do pick up an extraordinary number of Senate seats. I don't expect that the Democratic gains, and there likely are to be gains, but they won't be that dramatic, in part because of the big Democratic gains in 2018. Democrats netted 40 House seats and thus picked most of the low-lying fruit in those 2018 midterms. Still, they could expect to pick up a half dozen to maybe even 15 House seats, making for a pretty significant two-cycle, 2018 and 2020, two electoral cycle haul of about 50 to 60 seats, all told. This, of course, is the shape of the race, presidency, Senate, House, as we understand it now. Again, I think it could shift, and every day matters. There aren't a lot left, and 2016 told us that events in the last couple of weeks and those late-breaking undecided voters, though there were more in 2016 than there are now, but those late-breaking undecided voters can shift the outcome of a race. And Donald Trump is known for doing dramatic things and having dramatic and unexpected impacts on our politics. So this race could shift with big events like tonight's debate. So watch if you can, or if a new revelation comes out. I think the Trump campaign is going to be talking mostly about the economy and taxes, to the extent that they're able to get that message out in the last days of the race. But time might be running short, and as I said, there's only 2 weeks left to go. But of course, it's 2020 when 2 weeks is like 6 months. Just think of how much has happened in the last 2 weeks, and how many times we were certain in 2016 that we knew what was going to happen. With that note of uncertainty, I'm happy to take questions if you have any. I know that was a lot of information.
Thanks, Doug. This was great. If anyone has questions, please don't hesitate to use the chat function, and we'll make sure to relay that to Dr. Harris. No. Well, Dr. Harris, I have a question for you. How has it been teaching this semester with all of the uncertainty and everything else surrounding this election? Has it been different than in teaching other semesters?
Yeah, it certainly has been different than teaching other semesters, in part because I'm interacting with my students on Zoom, and some of my students are all over the country, so they can tell me what's happening in a Senate race because they're living in the state where it's happening, and so that's been quite different. I think I have noticed that students are a little more anxious, as I think many of us are, about voting processes, but they're more interested than normal. Loyola students are always good that way. Loyola political science students are always great that way. But I have noticed that they're even more informed and more interested. We did a thing a couple of weeks ago. The first assignment in class was predict the outcome of the presidential race. And this was the first assignment before we ever started getting into the literature. And they did their predictions. I tallied up their predictions. And on that day, it was 80% thought Biden was going to win and 20% thought Trump was going to win. I happened to go to Nate Silver's prediction site. And on that very day that I was reporting back to the students, it was an 80-20 split on Nate Silver too. So Loyola students are doing great.
Wow, that's great. That's great. And we actually do have a couple of questions in the chat. So Caitlin Doyle asks, I am curious why you think South Carolina's Senate race is lean Republican and not a toss-up based on the latest polls, fundraising, et cetera.
It's a good question. It's because despite what you may have taken from my presentation, I'm a little skeptical of polling. So I like polling information. It's data I can count on. Um, I still find it inferior to actual election counts. So I need to see a little more polling from South Carolina that has it tied or Harrison up, um, before I will go from my default position that South Carolina is probably going to stay Republican. It is a race that I'm watching very closely, and yeah, and as you can see from the question, um, Cook Political Report agrees with the premise of your question too. So um, I think it just comes to the fact that I'm a little more conservative, and I'm I'm the last to know when something big shifts.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Stacy Carell, and she says, "Do you think the lack of a real primary season will change anything about that system? It is frustrating that Maryland's primary comes so late in the season that it has so little to no impact on the candidate choice."
Yeah, I've always been frustrated by the same thing, as a lifelong Marylander myself, and I think the changes that we've seen this year in terms of how voting happened and how the primaries themselves were conducted have been an opportunity for states to experiment, a necessity for states to experiment. And I do think that um, we will see some significant changes going forward. That states that had been resistant to mail-in balloting before will will have will open up that process, and more states will use it. As a student of campaigns and elections, I think we're going to look back um, at 2020 as this demarcation point between, there were pre-COVID elections and post-COVID elections, and there will be new balloting laws, new participation rules, and a lot of new campaign forms in regard to fundraising and interactive events and those kinds of things, that where you don't have to get everybody together. Campaigns have been moving in that direction, but but this was something that caused all of them to take a big jump. I'm not sure I answered that question. Um, I don't think that the Democrats are poised to really change their primary process right now, with the possible exception of reducing the number of caucuses, and maybe finally, given the problems they had this year, knocking Iowa off of its first in the nation perch.
It's interesting. Thank you. We have a question from Zach Peters, and he says, "Hi, Dr. Harris. Any speculation on the future of the Republican Party post-Trump? We see incredibly popular centrist Republicans like our own Governor Larry Hogan, popular in their home states on both sides of the aisle, but struggle nationally."
This is a really good question. So, and one that I've been thinking a lot about. I tend to think I gave a hint of this in my talk. I think of parties as having what I call office seekers, who want to grow the tent and have as big a majority as they can, and those are the big tent people, right? And then parties are also composed of what I call benefit seekers, who would rather be true, ideological, and if necessary, small and committed, in part because the benefit seekers don't want to share the benefits with others, right? That there are benefits to having won an election, and you want to be the one who gets the job, or you want to be the one who gets to control the policy, and you don't want to have to compromise with others because the tent has to be big. And I think what we're going to see, should Democrats make big gains in the Senate, make additional gains in the House, regardless of what happens in the White House, um, I tend to think that the Republican Party is going to be smaller and more ideological. And for some time, we're going to see the benefit seeker model shrinking. That historically we'd expect a party not to moderate after a big loss, but to move to its extreme. I remember after the 2010 elections, I had students who were asking me, this was the election, Barack Obama's first midterm. The students would ask me, because I studied congressional leadership races, if Nancy Pelosi was in trouble now that she was no longer speaker, and the Democrats had lost their majority. And her primary rival for leadership in the House Democratic Caucus is Steny Hoyer from Maryland. And I said, no, she's in a stronger position, because all of the people who lost in 2010, they were Hoyer voters in the caucus. That if the Democratic Party lost in 2010 because it had moved too far to the left, it wasn't those on the left that lost their seats. It was those in the middle who lost their seats. So the Democratic Party moved more to the left, became more concentrated and unified behind Nancy Pelosi. And I think we'll see kind of the same thing, that we'll see a more conservative Republican leadership, more conservative congressional Republican party if this election goes the way we think it is.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Eleanor Kelly. Have you noticed a trend in how your students tend to lean politically? Do you often see changes in opinion after teaching in class discussions?
I don't see a lot of changes in opinion after class discussions. And in part because my classes tend on the more analytical side. And, I'll tell my students, I have no interest in persuading you. I think that's somebody else's job. If what I wanted to do for a living was to persuade people to think politically, I'd go work for a campaign or a political party. That's what they do. So I don't see a lot of persuasion in that sense. I have noticed, I got to Loyola in the fall of 2002, and I have noticed that the student body has perhaps gotten a little more moderate, moved a little to the left from when I got here, where there were always really robust college Republicans and college Democrats at Loyola. And what I always loved about Loyola is that they were great friends when they weren't debating one another. I have noticed, especially in the last couple of semesters, the last couple of years, a move slightly to the left. But I tend to think of that less about Loyola and more about generation, right? So if we were to go back to those figures on young voters and how they feel about Trump versus Biden, and especially how they feel about Republicans versus Democrats, this is a strategic problem for Republicans. Younger voters are tending much more towards the Democrats than the Republicans, and that seems to be a strategic problem and something that's going to grow and something that's going to have to be addressed. So I think Loyola students, being of that cohort, are moving probably less so than the rest of the generation.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions for Dr. Harris? Give it just a second to see if any more come in. Oh, we see one more coming in. Why do you think younger voters are trending Democratic?
Sure. I think that, first of all, it's an empirical fact. So you can trace this through national election studies, through public opinion studies. The reason, I think, has much more to do with sort of cultural transformation when it comes to questions of inclusiveness, when it comes to questions of diversity. And I think they see the world that they live in their own schools, in their own clubs and organizations, they see that more reflected demographically in a Democratic Party that seems to be more diverse and younger. And I think that they are moving in that direction, more out of that kind of cultural openness. And and it's not just me who thinks this, right? This was after Mitt Romney's loss in 2012. Republican consultants said we need to change on some of these issues. We need to find a way to talk to millennials. We need to find a way to be more inclusive, because that's what they see in their own youth culture, and they want to see it reflected back to them by their political leaders. And which is why the exciting things happening for Republicans as people plan for the future are those candidacies that do seek to represent some of that diversity and some of that openness to it, because I think those are the Republicans who are building for a future, because the future in America is more demographically diverse, and those younger voters are going to vote for many more electoral cycles than I am, and that's just a fact.
Great, thank you. Well, Dr. Harris, thank you so much for joining us. This was great, really insightful, and I think very timely as we head into tonight's debate and into the rest of the election season. So we appreciate you being here with us today. And I want to thank all of our alumni and friends who joined us as well. We will post this to the alumni website just as soon as we can, so that if you missed a part of it, or if you have a friend who might want to check it out, they can. So we'll thank everybody, and hope you all stay well.
Thank you.